For those of you who have not had the absolute delight of meeting or crossing paths with Dr. Wendi Roscoe, she has been heavily involved in, especially in the early days, in helping us to identify speakers for our Wednesday roundtable events. And then she went off to do some other things, and Gloria and others were so terrific at picking up that ball and running with it. And Wendi has come back to talk to us as a presenter tonight. So as indicated in the invitation that you got for tonight's event, if you caught for those who don't know, Wendi is a well-beloved and active member of our Scientific and Medical Advisory Board. She is Dr. Roscoe. She has a PhD in physiology. She did neuroimmunology research at the University of Western Ontario, and I won't say for 10 years, because I'm sure you don't want to think it was 10 years. Think of it as 2, then you feel younger. And that you taught biology, anatomy, and physiology at Fanshawe College. I think that's in London, right? Fanshawe College in London for the last 15 years. You're also a holistic nutritionist. I've been talking to you about coughs and chronic coughs, and she's been helping the vaccine injured through our telehealth or the telehealth organization, and is doing nutrition research with Dr. Henry Ealy. And Dr. Ealy joined us recently, and Wendi was the moderator for that event. So if you're thinking, I think I saw Wendi somewhere. Yes, you saw her during the presentation with Henry Ealy, where she was the moderator. So she's coming in to speak tonight about autophagy. Some people call it autophagy. Tomato. That can be used induced by fasting. So hot topic these days, intermittent fasting, right? I've seen intermittent fasting coming all over the place. So you're going to talk to about autophagy as an effective way to promote natural healing. So Wendi, please enlighten us. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you. So tonight I want to talk about energy. I want to talk about the mitochondria, which are the main organelles that make energy, and this process that we can induce called autophagy or autophagy, where we can sort of clean up old or damaged organelles or cell components, misfolded proteins, all kinds of, basically it's like a cleaning up process in our body. And so I want to kind of go through, let me share my screen here. Okay, so the way that I want to kind of cover things, because how the cell works and how we use sugar and fat to make ATP affects how easy or difficult it would be to do some fasting where we can stimulate this autophagy and apoptosis process. And so we're going to look just quickly at a sort of stereotypic cell and which organelles I kind of want to focus on. So here we have a cell. Inside this purple thing is the nucleus. Inside the nucleus, we have our DNA, so our genetic material. And so if we're going to transcribe a gene, say our insulin gene, then that transcription process occurs in the nucleus. We make messenger RNA, and then the messenger RNA will leave the nucleus, and it will go to one of these red dots here called ribosomes. And then this is where protein synthesis occurs. And so sometimes our proteins will be modified by this Golgi apparatus, and then they can be packaged into these vesicles that can be exported out of the cell, or the protein can be used in the cell. And so just as a reference, so let's think about the COVID-19 vaccines. They are in lipid nanoparticles that contain messenger RNA that codes for the spike protein. And we know there's probably some other things in there as well, like maybe some DNA fragments, some other things. So when this messenger RNA gets taken up by the cell, these are the ribosomes where that messenger RNA would be transcribed into a spike protein. And then the spike protein would be produced and perhaps presented on the cell membrane or perhaps exported. So that's how that process happens. So inside the cell, we have a bunch of different organelles, and we need all of these organelles to be healthy and functioning optimally so that our tissues and our organ systems can all function optimally. So a couple of organelles I want to point out. One is the peroxisomes. So these are organelles that make peroxide, which is why it's called a peroxisome. Peroxide is H2O2. Maybe you have used it at some point in time to put on a cut. Well, these peroxisomes use oxygen that we breathe to produce this peroxide molecule, which is important for detoxifying substances. So our liver and our kidneys have a lot of peroxisomes that help us to detoxify substances. And so the peroxisomes actually also help to produce the fat molecules called phospholipids that make up our cell membranes. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then we have lysosomes. These are also important organelles. They contain all kinds of digestive enzymes. So they can help to break down old cell components into the individual building blocks like amino acids and nucleotides and things, and we can recycle those building blocks. And then we have our mitochondria. This is where we make our energy molecule, and our energy molecule is ATP. So energy is important to think about when we're thinking about fasting, because we need to be able to continue making energy when we're not consuming food. So I will talk more about the mitochondria. So just briefly looking at membranes. So these are the phospholipids that I talked about. They're made, the peroxisomes play a significant role in producing various types of phospholipids. So they're arranged in this bilayer. So the outer parts are polar, so they will be attracted to water inside and outside of the cell. And then these little tails are the fatty acids. And so this fat layer acts like a barrier. And so our membranes are like, they only let certain things in and out of the cells. So we will use these membrane proteins to bring nutrients in. So for example, we would use glucose transporters to bring glucose into the cell. So we need to have these membranes need to be healthy, and we don't want to have these fats being damaged or oxidized, because it will affect the proteins that are in the membranes. It'll affect cell communication, cell signaling, hormone binding, all of that kind of stuff. So we need all of these things to be optimal. So with our phospholipids, this is, I want to mention our essential fatty acids, so omega-3, 6, and 9. They're essential because we have to consume them. Our cells can't make these, so we have to eat them. Generally, we get enough omega-6, but usually we need to consume extra omega-3. Omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. It helps to calm the immune system down, whereas omega-6 stimulates the immune system. So these have to be in balance. Omega-9 is oleic acid, so this is essentially your olive oil, and this is very anti-inflammatory as well. So our cell membrane contains these phospholipids, cholesterol, membrane proteins, and then the membranes in our organelles are also composed of similar kinds of molecules. So looking at our energy molecule, so ATP is an adenosine triphosphate. So it basically, this part of it is kind of like a nucleotide. So when we look at our RNA and DNA, they're made up of nucleotides. And so our energy molecule, the sugar is a ribose, so it's kind of like an RNA nucleotide, but it has 3 phosphates. So the way that we use this for energy is when this last phosphate molecule can break off and it can bind to something else. So if it binds to a protein, it can change the conformational shape, which can make it move. So if you think about like your muscles contracting, then these phosphates binding to your myosin in your muscles make it move, and then your muscles can contract. But we use ATP for everything, for all kinds of chemical reactions in our cells. So we need to be able to make energy all the time. So what do we make energy out of? So where does the ATP come from? So we use sugar. Sugar, the main sugar that we use is glucose. So glucose is made of carbons and oxygens and hydrogens. And the reason why we can get energy out of glucose is because of these carbon-hydrogen bonds. So wherever there's a carbon-hydrogen bond, we're going to be basically breaking the sugar down, and we're going to keep these hydrogens. So a hydrogen ion is also called a proton, and I'm going to come back to that. So then when we look at fats, we can get energy out of fat as well. Energy in fat is also because of carbon-hydrogen bonds. So when we look at the different types of fats that we can use for energy, we can use saturated or unsaturated. So because we are animals, we store our excess energy as saturated fat. And saturated fat, because it has single bonds between all the carbons, then these fatty acid chains can be close together. And then at room temperature, it's generally a solid like butter. So generally, animal fats are more solid at room temperature. Coconut oil is a weird exception. It's a plant, but it's also high in saturated fats. And then when we have our unsaturated fats, they're unsaturated because they have double bonds. When there's a double bond between the carbons, then it makes the molecule bend. And when the molecule bends, that means they can't get as close together. So then it's going to be a liquid at room temperature. So if there's only one double bond, then it's a monounsaturated, like olive oil. Olive oil is high in omega-9, oleic acid. Then I just want to point out too that these are the trans fats that we want to avoid. The only difference between a healthy unsaturated fat and an unhealthy unsaturated fat is the orientation of the hydrogens around this double bond. So when they're in this trans chemical configuration, they become inflammatory. So we want the hydrogens to be on the same side, and it seems like such a tiny difference, but it matters. And so when we're eating trans fats, we're going to be increasing inflammation. So most of these kinds of fats are going to be the refined processed seed oils like canola oil, corn oil, vegetable oil, those kinds of things. So also, when we have double bonds, just really quickly, these are a little bit more delicate. So when you buy olive oil, get the olive oil that's in a dark bottle and make sure it's organic and extra virgin, and then it will be good unsaturated fatty acids that won't be oxidized. Okay, so we're going to be collecting hydrogen ions from either oxidizing our sugars or oxidizing our fats, and oxidizing in a good way because we're going to use these molecules to make energy. So I want to mention glucose metabolism and fat metabolism. So when we have glucose metabolism, basically, glucose metabolism is the easiest thing for our body to do. So when our blood sugar starts to decrease, our body naturally wants us to eat because it's easier to make ATP out of sugar. So it wants to use sugar. It's the easiest thing to do. It takes more energy to go to the fat cells and to break down fat. So this is why we can store more and more and more extra energy in our adipose tissue and still be hungry. Okay, so this is important when we're thinking about how we're going to do some fasting. So when we consume food and our blood sugar increases, our glucose is going to go up. This increase in glucose is going to stimulate the production of insulin. The way that insulin works is it has to bind to a receptor. So hormones always have to bind to a receptor in a membrane. So it's a protein in a membrane or inside the cell. But anyways, these are on this outside of the cell membrane or in the cell membrane. And so insulin will bind to its receptor. And when it does, it signals the production of glucose transporters. When we have glucose transporters, the sugar can bind and then come into the cell. Now, when we have insulin resistance, this can happen if we have tons and tons of sugar all the time or frequently, and then we produce tons and tons of insulin frequently for a long period of time. When we have lots of insulin for a long period of time, what the cells will do is they will stop making insulin receptors. They will decrease the production of insulin receptors. This is insulin resistance. When we decrease insulin receptor production, that means we're decreasing the production of these glucose transporters. So then what happens is this glucose stays outside of the cell, and then we have high blood sugar. If you're curious about, where you are potentially on the insulin resistance spectrum, you can have a blood test and you can look at your hemoglobin A1C. If your hemoglobin A1C is high, that means you have lots of glucose, making lots of insulin, affecting your insulin receptors. So that's a blood test you can do to check that out. So we want to be able to keep our insulin receptors sensitive. We want to have the insulin receptors so that we make these glucose transporters. When we are going to do some intermittent fasting or extended fasting, we increase our insulin sensitivity so we can bring these insulin receptors back. Now, when we look at fat metabolism, my little thing didn't work there for a second. So in our adipose tissue, so this is the fat that we store underneath our skin. This is where we have adipocytes, where we store fat, saturated fat. When we use our stored fat, we can break that down into fatty acids. We can also produce ketones. And then those fatty acids can also be used to make glucose. So our liver can convert fatty acids into glucose, and we can put that into the bloodstream to keep our blood sugar stable. So let's suppose your blood sugar starts to decrease and you start to get hungry, but let's suppose you're busy and you can't eat. What is your body going to do? It's going to go to the fat cells. You're going to break down fat. You can use the fatty acids or you can make ketones, and your body, like your muscles, can use that directly to make energy, or you can use it to make glucose and keep your blood sugar up. So when we store extra nutrients, we can store extra carbohydrates as glycogen, which is just sort of branched chains of glucose molecules. So our liver can store glycogen and our muscles can store glycogen. And so then when our blood sugar goes down, or when we're exercising, or we have stress, or we need extra energy, we can break down glycogen, we can use blood sugar, we can break down fat. Our body should be adapted to be able to use sugar and fat. Okay? So when we think about, so back here, insulin is the only hormone that we produce that makes us store nutrients. When we are looking at breaking down nutrients so that we can make energy, we have at least 5 different main hormones that are involved in causing fats and glycogen to be broken down. So we have multiple redundancies is basically what I'm saying. If we have stored fat, we can break that down and we can make energy. So we have glucagon made by the pancreas, which is basically like the opposite of insulin. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Where did my mouse go? Oh, cortisol is one of our stress hormones, same with adrenaline. So when we have stress, we need to make energy. So these two hormones will help us break down fat. Our thyroid hormones are all about metabolism and help us to break down fats. And growth hormone will also help us to break down stored fat. So we always have multiple ways of increasing our blood sugar. When we look at ketones, because we generally don't make ketones unless we're fasting. So the three main ketones, we have three main ketones that we can produce. So when we break down fatty acids, we can produce these molecules. They can join that whole Krebs cycle process of making ATP in the mitochondria by being converted into this molecule called acetyl coenzyme A. So this is acetyl-CoA, and we can get to this point by either oxidizing glucose, or we can break down fatty acids. We can convert acetyl coenzyme A into fats. We can store excess energy as fat if we don't need it at the time. So when we eat a big meal and we have extra nutrients, then it will go in this direction. So then we can break down the fats or the ketones and we can use it to make ATP. When we are fasting, by the way, we can measure our blood glucose levels and we can measure our blood ketone levels. And then based on how much of those we have in our blood, we can figure out if we're reaching that autophagy process. So when we look at the mitochondria, so I just want to talk a little bit again about those protons. When we break down glucose, we go through this process called glycolysis, and we make a molecule called pyruvate. If for some reason you're doing high intensity exercise, pyruvate can become lactate or lactic acid, and then that will give you that burning muscle feeling. And this can happen without oxygen. Once we move into the mitochondria, then we go through basically this Krebs cycle, and then we have an electron transport chain. So in the mitochondria, we have two membranes, an outer membrane and the inner membrane, and then there's this little space in between. So as we collect these NADH molecules, through either glycolysis or through the Krebs cycle, through pyruvate oxidation, whether we're breaking down glucose or we're breaking down fats and fatty acids that are joining the process here, the idea is that we're collecting these hydrogen ions or these protons. These protons are important for the electron transport chain function, and then we can make lots and lots of energy. So this is looking at this inner membrane here. This is where we have our electron transport chain. So as we build up these NADH molecules and FADH2, these, by the way, are made from B vitamins. So NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, but basically it comes from niacin. And we have riboflavin, so we need our B vitamins to be able to break down our sugars and our fats to collect these protons. When we move electrons through these big proteins in the electron transport chain, they act like proton pumps. And so we're pumping these protons into this space. So then once we have a gradient of protons, we have another enzyme molecule, this membrane protein here called ATP synthase. And then all of these protons will move through this specific protein. It'll want to move down the concentration gradient. Sorry if you can hear my dog barking. And then we make tons of ATP. So it's all about moving these protons, which is how we get energy. So now I want to just point out a couple of things. So one, I want to talk about protein pump inhibitors. So these are drugs that sometimes people take if they have acid reflux or heartburn, because it prevents the production in the stomach of hydrochloric acid, because there we have a hydrogen again, which is a proton. So blocking proton pumps decreases the acid that is produced, but it also affects our mitochondria and it affects our whole energy process. So there's other ways to deal with acid reflux. If you have that situation, just consider that perhaps proton pump inhibitors are affecting your mitochondria. And also statins, I want to mention statins because they have an impact on this molecule here called coenzyme Q. Statins tend to deplete coenzyme Q, which affects the electron transport chain, which affects our ability to make energy. And this includes muscles like the heart, which is a muscle, it's cardiac muscle. So anyone that is taking a statin drug should consider taking ubiquinol or ubiquinone or coenzyme Q as a supplement. Many doctors don't tell people about that, but this is a really important aspect and why statin drugs can have some side effects. And then I wanted to also mention peroxide. So earlier I talked about peroxisomes and how peroxisomes make peroxide. Mitochondria also can use oxygen to make peroxide. So when we're moving these protons through this ATP synthase molecule, we use oxygen and we combine it with the protons and we make water. But we can also make peroxide, which is H2O2. So we want this to be in balance. We do want to have some peroxide because it does help to detoxify things. But if we have too much peroxide, then we have an inflammatory condition where we're oxidizing things that we don't necessarily want to oxidize. Okay, so this is the sort of conclusion part of the energy aspect of things. And I want to point out all the different kinds of nutrients that we use to make energy. So a lot of people have low energy or brain fog. You know, think about energy. We have about 1,000 mitochondria in all of our cells. Everything uses energy, not just muscles, right? Our brain, our liver, our digestive tract, our immune system. So we need to have lots of energy for lots of functions. And if you are depleted in the building blocks or the micronutrients that your cells need to be able to make energy, then you're going to have fatigue. So we need to have B vitamins so that we can make these NAD and FAD molecules, so we can carry these protons. We need it to make the acetyl-CoA molecule. We need our omega-3. These are essential. This is an essential fat because we can't make it. So we have to consume it. And this helps our membranes to be healthy, including the mitochondrial membranes. We need vitamin C and our tocopherols, our vitamin E for antioxidants. This helps to decrease the oxidizing effect of free radicals like reactive oxygen molecules and peroxides. We need minerals, zinc and magnesium and copper and iron to act as coenzymes to either make ATP or to use ATP. And then I talked about the coenzyme Q, and then carnitine. This is a molecule that a lot of athletes like because it helps to increase the ability of the cells to use fats for energy. So when we look at these different components of the cell, the mitochondria, the peroxisomes, the lysosomes, mitochondria have lots of different functions. It's not just about making energy. They also produce peroxide. They're also involved in producing heat. They're involved in regulating apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. We want to be able to kill damaged cells, but we don't want to have so much apoptosis that we're overly killing cells that we don't necessarily need to kill, right? Everything always has to be in balance, in regulation. Our mitochondria make cholesterol, they regulate calcium, they build heme, which we use to carry oxygen. So mitochondria have lots and lots of functions. And what happens if our mitochondria don't function properly? So just like with the peroxisomes, if they're not functioning properly, they're going to oxidize our membrane phospholipids, that our cell membrane won't work properly. If mitochondria don't work properly, then it's going to affect all kinds of things, including our energy, also our peroxide production. It'll affect inflammation. Reactive oxygen species can damage our DNA, accelerate aging. We need to have regulated apoptosis. It affects every single body system. And then senescence is a type of, it's like when a cell ages and it doesn't function completely properly, but it's not it's an old cell, so it's still there and using energy and nutrients, but it isn't totally functioning the way that it's supposed to. So we have these, senescent cells that can be produced. So every body system can be affected if our mitochondria are not working properly. So what would make them not work properly? Why would our organelles and cells get damaged? Where is this damage coming from? How come our body isn't just working perfectly? And that's because we are exposed to a huge amount of toxins. In some ways, if you think about, my next slide is a whole list of all the possible, not all the possible, it's actually a very small chunk of toxins that we're exposed to. And it's actually pretty remarkable that we can deal with all of this stuff and still, for the most part, function properly. Although, we do have quite a lot of increase in chronic health disease, chronic inflammatory diseases. And I think toxins play a really huge role in why we have so many symptoms of toxicity and mitochondrial dysfunction and energy depletion and increased inflammation. We have oxidative stress, so altered peroxide production, excess free radicals. These things are going to damage our cells and our organelles. Inflammation, which can be caused by damaged tissues, by infections, toxins again, and reactive oxygen species. Nutrient deficiencies, if we don't have enough minerals and micronutrients, vitamins that act as cofactors to help our enzymes to build molecules and repair and regenerate our cells, then our cells aren't going to be able to function properly. Radiation, this includes EMF. Some people are very sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies that can damage cells. And then age-related, different people can have more or less sort of age-related effects. And I think that it just goes back to the accumulation of these things. So the longer we're around, the more exposed to things that we are. Here's a nice little list of toxins. So we are exposed to so much stuff. Everything from air pollution, heavy metals, pesticides and herbicides that are sprayed on our food, way more in recent years than compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. Disinfectants, even in water treatment. We have our alkyl phenols, our forever chemicals. We have bacteria and viruses and molds and plastics, and there's just a crazy amount of toxic things that are in our environment. Also consider medications, drugs, and vaccines. So with vaccines, we have adjuvants. In the COVID vaccines, the lipid nanoparticles act as an adjuvant, which sort of hyperstimulates the immune system. We also know that there's probably a bunch of other things, whether it's spike protein, the messages to make spike protein, polyethylene glycol, perhaps graphene oxide, nanotechnology, metals, right? So there's a whole, and maybe even plasmid fragment DNA contamination, all kinds of things. And then add on top of that some bad habits that people have, your stress gets out of control, and then people use different, unhealthy coping strategies, even things like junk food and processed seed oils and trans fats and restaurant food. Like, even if you go to a restaurant and you think you're ordering something healthy, they're using canola oil, which is a refined processed seed oil that's high in omega-6, and it's oxidized. Once you heat it, it's going to become a trans fat that's inflammatory, right? So we're exposed to all kinds of things. So how do we deal with this? How can we help our body deal with this amount of bombardment of stuff? I think that our bodies can do a really miraculous job of healing and repairing and regenerating if we have a balance where all of the good things are outweighing the bad things. So if we're getting sun, we're eating healthy food molecules, clean water, we're getting sleep, we're exercising, and then we have some periods of time when we're not eating so that we can have this cleaning out autophagy process. And if we try to minimize our reactive oxygen species, our toxins, bad habits, chronic stress and chronic cortisol affects the immune system. And then when we have our chronic inflammatory conditions, which all of these things can sort of keep spiraling around, and, toxins increase inflammation, and it all kind of feeds on itself. So the more that we can reduce the bad things and the more that we can increase the good things, then we can generally be in a place where our body can cope with a lot of stuff. And if this was reversed, as these negative things increase and the good things decrease, you eat crappy food, you don't get enough sleep, you scrap exercising, and then you have bad habits, and then, then we're going to start to have symptoms, and then that's going to eventually lead into disease. So this is my top 10 list. My top 10 list of things that everyone can basically do that will basically help to increase the good things and decrease the bad things. And my order changes all the time. And, probably about 20 years ago, my list was eat, sleep, exercise. That was sort of my mantra. But now it's expanded to 10 things. And I think, the more that we can incorporate these good things, the more chance we give our body to be able to heal and recover and regenerate. And so what I want to focus on is the fasting, having periods of time of not eating, because we can stimulate autophagy and we can stimulate appropriate apoptosis. And first, I want to actually talk about stress tolerance, because we can make our bodies more resilient and more able to deal with things if we give it little bits of stress that make us stronger. And so hormesis is a process where some stress is good. And if we give our body little bits of stress in the right amount at the right time, it can be beneficial. Okay, if we wrapped ourselves in cotton and we never had anything negative that we ever had to deal with, we actually would become weaker, right? We need to exercise, even though when we exercise, it's breaking down our muscle fibers, it's damaging the muscles. But when we're not exercising, we're repairing and we're regenerating. And the reason our muscles get stronger is because the stress of the exercise stimulates the processes of building and regenerating. So just like exercise stimulates us to get stronger, other things do too. So these are the main stressors that in the right amount can be good. And too much of anything is going to be bad. If you are not used to exercising and you decide to go run a marathon, you're going to end up with rhabdomyolysis. So it's always about, building up gradually and letting your body adapt. Okay, doing anything too extreme is going to be too harsh and it's not going to be beneficial. So cold exposure is beneficial. It stimulates brown fat. Norepinephrine, which is one of our stress hormones, stimulates this uncoupling protein in the mitochondria. It makes protons leak out, and then we produce heat, and we can burn fat. We can increase our actual basal metabolic rate with some cold exposure. And by cold exposure, I mean, 30 seconds in a cold shower, right? Not hypothermia. And heat exposure. So think about sitting in a sauna. When we have heat exposure, we stimulate heat shock proteins, and this does all kinds of good things to reduce misfolded proteins and aggregated proteins, and we can regulate apoptosis, and it can stimulate the immune system. If you're getting sick, for example, sitting in a sauna can be very beneficial. Also increases blood flow and does some other stuff. Low oxygen or hypoxia. So when we have little bits of time with low oxygen, it stimulates this molecule called hypoxia inducible factor. And this stimulates more mitochondria to grow. So mitochondrial biogenesis. And then we'll make more mitochondria that can make more energy. Mitophagy is like autophagy, but it's specific to breaking down mitochondria. And so with low oxygen, so this includes altitude training, and you can even do it by holding your breath periodically. It's good for your body to have these little intermittent bits of not having enough oxygen. It'll stimulate the body to make more mitochondria. Just like, if you train on a mountain, then you're going to make more red blood cells. You can actually even buy masks. You can buy altitude training masks, and you can adjust the flow so that you can have more or less oxygen, and you can just wear them for a couple of minutes, or you can put it on a low setting and go for a walk, or some people train with them. So there's cool things that you can do with that. And then what we're going to focus on, though, is low nutrients. So when we have periods of time when we're not eating, then we're going to stimulate this autophagy process. And the main signaling molecules that are involved that are really important is AMPK and sirtuins. So when we have low nutrient intake, we stimulate this process where we can break down old organelles or misfolded proteins or damaged any damaged organelles. So like if we have too many peroxisomes that are making too much peroxide and they're not functioning properly to make good phospholipids, or the mitochondria aren't, they're getting damaged, we can get rid of those organelles. And so this process involves forming this phagophore, which is a membrane just like the plasma membrane that will surround these damaged cell components, and it forms this autophagosome that will then combine with a lysosome. So I talked about this at the beginning. The lysosomes are those organelles that have a lot of digestive enzymes, and they'll break all of these things down into the building block components like fatty acids and amino acids and nucleotides. And then we can recycle these and we can use them to build new organelles that are healthier and better. So how does our cell know what is damaged? So we have these molecules called ubiquitin ligases, and they have this ability. It's more complex, but I'll just make it simple. These things can label, they can so this ligase here can label things that are messed up, and then our cells know that this is what we need to get rid of. And then anything that is healthy, all the organelles that are good, are going to stay in the cell and they're going to keep functioning properly. And so we can get rid of things that are damaged. Now, we only do this cleaning up process when we have hormesis. And basically, fasting is the best way to stimulate autophagy, where we get rid of these damaged organelles. So we need to have a balance between eating and building, and fasting and cleaning. So basically, when we're eating, anabolic processes are about building up. We're going to have protein synthesis. We're going to make insulin, which is going to tell our body to store energy. We're going to store fat. We're going to store glycogen. And we're preparing for a time when our energy intake is low. And then we have this pantry of stuff in our adipose tissue that we can rely on during periods of time when we don't have food. We produce mTOR, mammalian target of rapamycin. It's a molecule that is basically about stimulating protein synthesis. So athletes like mTOR, and this is why sometimes people that are competitively training, or like bodybuilders or power lifters, they want as much mTOR as possible. And so what they'll do for periods of time is eat all the time, eat protein all the time, because then you're going to stimulate mTOR. So insulin is stimulated primarily from carbs, but anything you eat will stimulate insulin, and this tells your body to store nutrients. mTOR basically tells your body to build proteins and tissues, and that includes your extracellular matrix proteins like collagen and elastin and those kinds of things. So whenever you're making insulin or mTOR, you are not in autophagy. So this is a building phase. When we are fasting, this is the catabolic or breaking down phase. This is when we're going to make glucagon and other hormones like the cortisol, adrenaline, growth hormone, thyroid hormones that help us break down stored energy like fat and glycogen to use for energy and to make blood sugar. And we will produce this molecule called AMPK that I'll talk about more in a second. And basically, this is when we break down stuff. And this process will be inhibited by mTOR. So as soon as you eat, then you're going to make mTOR and insulin, and then this process doesn't happen. So we have to be fasting for this process to happen. So AMPK is basically an energy sensor. So when we use our ATP, our energy molecules, and we break off our last phosphate and we use it, then we end up producing AMPK, or sorry, AMP, adenosine monophosphate, and then this protein kinase will detect this molecule. And when our energy levels are low and we make AMPK, then all kinds of really cool things happen. So basically, this molecule is going to inhibit the synthesis of things. It's going to stop making proteins, stop making lipids. It will help you to basically burn fats. You're going to oxidize fat to be able to make energy, and we're going to stimulate the process of making new mitochondria. It will tell the cells to take up blood sugar because we're going to use that blood sugar to make energy, and then it will make your blood sugar decrease, but your blood sugar will only ever decrease to a certain stable point, unless you have true hypoglycemia, which a lot of people don't. And if you do, then obviously fasting won't be for you. But for the most part, people will get to a certain blood sugar level, and then other systems will kick in to help maintain that. So your liver will use fats to make new glucose so that you can keep your blood sugar stable, because your brain really likes to have stable blood sugar. AMPK will stimulate lipid metabolism so that we can use fatty acids and we can use ketones. The other cool thing that happens when we make AMPK is that it inhibits inflammation. And this is a really great thing for people that have chronic inflammatory conditions and people that have autoimmune conditions. Because when you have an autoimmune condition, your immune system is overreacting, and we want to calm that down. And you can calm that down by fasting. AMPK is going to stimulate that autophagy process where we break down old organelles or damaged cell components. It will inhibit mTOR. It will activate sirtuins. This family of molecules is really, really cool. These are our longevity molecules. Sirtuins are what help us these are like our anti-aging molecules, and they are very important for regulating apoptosis. So they will increase apoptosis when we have damaged cells without overdoing it. We don't want to overkill cells unless they're super damaged. We don't want cells that are mutated to the point of potentially being cancerous, right? So we want to be able to get rid of those cells. And then AMPK also stimulates the production of new lysosomes so that we can use those to break down the damaged organelles. So all kinds of really cool things with our AMPK molecule. So just quickly, the difference between autophagy and apoptosis. Autophagy is basically about our proteins misfolded, aggregated, weird mutant proteins. So let's suppose if we have plasmid DNA contamination in the COVID-19 vaccines, and they're producing weird proteins, or because of the pseudouridine in the messenger RNA causing those frame shifts that we've heard about, and then unusual proteins are being formed. Autophagy is a process that could potentially target those weird proteins and get rid of them. And so autophagy is about breaking down proteins and old or damaged organelles, whereas apoptosis is a programmed cell death process that gets rid of cells, damaged cells. So cancerous cells, virus-infected cells, or old cells that are not functioning properly or that have an accumulation of DNA damage. So we want both of these processes to happen. This is a really good cleaning out process that we want to happen. So apoptosis is stimulated by sirtuins, but also some other things like cellular stress. So that goes back to our hormesis, cold exposure, heat shock proteins, low oxygen, those things. And then when we just look just briefly at a little bit about sirtuins, these are also important for DNA repair. So we want, there's a whole family of sirtuins. We could probably do a whole talk about these molecules, but generally they're involved in apoptosis and they're involved in DNA repair. And this is important because there's lots of reasons why we have DNA damage. We make DNA mutations during normal cell cycle regulation. Every time we replicate DNA, we have some proofreading abilities, but we do end up accumulating some mutations through DNA replication. And then the exposure to all these toxins, right? There's a lot of mutagens and carcinogens and things in our environment, our water and our air and our food that can damage DNA. And so we want to be able to repair these. We have a lot of DNA repair enzymes that can recognize DNA damage, and we can fix a lot of DNA mutations. And one of the ways that we can stimulate or increase this DNA repair process is by stimulating sirtuins. One way to do that is by fasting. And also, mice that have mutations in sirtuins have accelerated aging. So again, these are like our anti-aging molecules. So we can increase sirtuins with calorie restriction or fasting. Fasting, by the way, doesn't always mean that you're reducing your calories. You're not necessarily taking in fewer calories. You're just eating all of your calories in a window of time, And I'll talk about that more in a second. Another thing that stimulates sirtuins, though, which is also really great for anybody that is high risk for cancer, is you want to have polyphenols. You can take polyphenols as a supplement, or you can include colorful things. Google polyphenols or foods that are high in polyphenols. You completely can't go wrong by consuming these. They're antioxidants. They contain all kinds of really great molecules that help our cells in lots of ways. And one of those ways is to stimulate sirtuins. Okay, so when we talk about fasting, when should we not fast? Okay, number one reason is if you don't want to. So sometimes I get a lot of resistance from people about fasting, and they think that they have to eat all the time, and they think that something terrible is going to happen if they don't eat all the time. And so if you don't want to, then don't fast, because you'll have a nocebo effect, and it won't end up being beneficial. So you have to remember too that Homo sapiens lived, most of the last 200,000 years with lots of fasting because food wasn't always available. Our biology is set up so that we are able to have periods of time without eating. But there are times when it will be more difficult. So if you are doing intense physical training, especially if you're trying to build muscle, if you're, bodybuilding or doing a powerlifting competition or something like that, then you're going to want all the mTOR you can get, and you're probably not going to want to fast while you're training. If you start a new exercise program, it will be extremely difficult to fast and start exercising. So what a lot of people do is they're like, okay, I am motivated. I am going to turn a new leaf, and I'm going to start doing all these good things. And they try to add exercise and fasting at the same time. But what happens when you add in exercise, that's a whole new adaptation all by itself. And your brain might freak out a little bit and make you hungrier. So don't try to fast if you're starting a workout program. Start the workout program, eat as much as your brain thinks that you need to, just to let it adapt and get over that little hurdle of doing something new. Once that tapers out, then you can start thinking about doing some fasting. With females, everybody is individual, but some people find it difficult to fast during the luteal phase. So in the female cycle, the first 2 weeks is the follicular phase where you're building the egg, then you ovulate, then you have the luteal phase. And this is sort of the PMS phase where you're craving things. It's hard to fast in the luteal phase. So females can keep that in mind. During pregnancy, you're growing a human, so eat whenever you need to. If you're younger than 16, it's not advisable. However, young people tend to fast naturally. Young people don't eat when they're not hungry, and they eat when they are hungry, and that's good. And then if you're recovering from a surgery, an injury, anything where you need to have a lot of protein to rebuild, not a good time to fast. And then lastly, if you're sick, there's two sort of situations with being sick. Sometimes you're starving when you're sick, and you should listen to your body and you should eat. If you're hungry when you're sick, your body wants you to eat nutrients because your immune system needs it. But sometimes when you're sick, you have no appetite. And that is okay too. If your body doesn't want you to eat, it wants to stimulate autophagy, and it knows that that's better for you. So in both situations, I think that you should listen to your body. Now, when we look at the different types of fasting, one of the things I want to talk about first is time-restricted eating. And when we time restrict our eating, it basically means we eat all the same amount of calories as normal, but we're going to squish it into a window of time. So instead of eating spread over a 14 or 15 hour, day, we're going to squish it into an 8 or a 10-hour day. And then the rest of the time, you're not going to eat. So you're not decreasing your calories, you're just squishing them into a window. Okay, and this is beneficial, and I'll talk about that more in a second. But we also have intermittent fasting, which basically means you eat at different times randomly, and you can have periods of time where you don't eat for a day, or you skip lunch, or you skip breakfast, or you push breakfast. Intermittent just sort of means that you're taking periods of time when you don't eat. And it could be that you're just busy someday and you don't have time to eat till later. We should be able to cope with that. We should be able to, let's suppose you're planning to have lunch at 1 o'clock, and then your car breaks down and you're like, well, crap. Now I have to walk to that gas station. It's going to take me half an hour. You should be able to do that. You should be able to push the lunch, an hour or two, walk without fainting, right? We should be able to dip into all that stored energy that we have in our adipose cells, right? So again, it's a way of being resilient to stresses. And then short fast. So anything, 16 to 24 hours is kind of a short fast. Anything over that is considered an extended fast. So autophagy, optimal autophagy, happens between 36 and 72 hours. And it's going to take a little bit of time for your body to get adapted to that. So don't just jump into a 3-day fast, because it's going to feel extremely terrible. So I will talk about how you can sort of build up to that. The first thing that you need to do before you even think about doing a 3-day fast is you need to have your blood sugar regulated. So when we're eating, let's suppose you're eating sweets, you have sugar cravings, and then you eat some sugar and then your blood sugar goes up. Then you're going to make all kinds of insulin, and then your blood sugar is going to drop and it's going to go down. And then it's going to make you hungry, and then you're going to crave stuff. So then you're going to eat something and your blood sugar is going to go up. When your blood sugar is kind of all over the place, it's going to be very difficult to regulate your appetite. Oops, wait, I want to do one other thing. So if we can keep our blood sugar, sort of more moderate, then that takes away all kinds of hunger, cravings, mood stuff. Have you ever been hangry, right? So you need to eat and you get all irritable and cranky. So our blood sugar is highly connected with our mood and our hormones. It's connected with inflammation. When you have fluctuating blood sugar, it affects your whole immune system. And so how we regulate our blood sugar, three main things, is basically the quality of the food. So if you're eating whole foods, plants and animals, then that is definitely better for blood sugar fluctuations compared to eating fast food, processed food, and junk food. And then we have the quantity of food. So the more you eat, the more insulin you make. And then we have the timing of food. And it turns out that the timing of when you eat actually has the biggest impact on being able to regulate your blood sugar, because it makes your body learn how to burn fat and sugar. You should be able to burn both fuels for energy. You should be able to intermix those. Okay. So if you have never done any kind of fasting or time restricted eating, then your first challenge for the first 7 days is to do a 10-hour eating window. So here are the rules. Try this for 7 days. Don't eat for the first 3 hours after you wake up. Don't eat for the last 3 hours before you go to sleep. And the first thing that you eat should be high in protein and healthy fat, and not a starch or a sugar. So let's suppose you wake up at 7 and you go to bed at 11. I know most people don't get enough sleep, but let's just suppose. We live in a magical world where we can get 8 hours sleep. If you wake up at 7, then you're going to have your first meal at 10. And that first meal is going to be something protein, like some boiled eggs, and it's not going to be cereal or a smoothie or a juice, okay? This is going to make a huge impact on your ability to regulate your blood sugar. Once you can regulate your blood sugar, all kinds of other things will fall into place. Your inflammation will decrease, your brain will be better, your mood will be better, all your energy will be better. Once you can do this, once you can do 10 hours, try squishing it into 8. And again, you're not decreasing your calories, you're just squishing them into a window. Once an 8-hour window is easy, then you can move on to try a 24-hour fast. And then once you can do a 24-hour fast, then you can try a 36 and a 48 and eventually a 72. You never need to do more than a 72 for autophagy. To have optimal autophagy, you want to be somewhere between 36 and 72 hours. So in the periods of time when you're not eating, what would break your fast? What should you not have? So anything that is going to stimulate insulin or mTOR will break your fast. So obviously no food. Artificial sweeteners can trick your body into making insulin. So nothing with fake sugar, no alcohol, no supplements that contain sweeteners. If you have coffee in the morning, it should be black and not with cream or sugar. No smoothies, no juice, no broth, no supplements like glutamine. Sometimes glutamine is used to heal leaky gut. Glutamine is an amino acid. It will stimulate mTOR. So you want to avoid those things. And then what can you have during a fast? So you can have black coffee, you can have all kinds of tea, you can have herbal tea, and actually I recommend consuming green tea because it has a lot of antioxidants that help you to deal with toxins that are released from your fat cells. So when we start breaking down fat for energy, we actually can release a lot of toxins. A lot of toxins that we're exposed to are fat soluble, and we store them in our fat. And so if you're not used to fasting and then you decide, you know what, I'm going to just do a 3-day fast, you're going to release all kinds of toxins from your fat cells, and then you're going to feel extremely horrible. So you don't want to do that, because that's not even actually going to be beneficial, because you're going to have more toxins in your body and it's not going to end up being good for you. So you want to do this process gradually. You can have proteolytic enzymes. So some people take nattokinase or serrapeptase or bromelain or proteolytic enzymes to break down fibrin clots or the spike protein. You can take those on an empty stomach and they won't stimulate insulin or mTOR. Some people will do apple cider vinegar. And some people will, because apple cider vinegar will have probiotics, so it'll be good for your microbiome. And if you're detoxing, you can do activated charcoal. If you get that super dizzy, fainty, yucky feeling, you can try a little bit of salt in a glass of water. It doesn't taste really great, but it can help with that blood pressure feeling. So you can have salt. Now, my last few slides are just a few cool things about fasting. When we're fasting, it is really, really good for your digestive tract. It's good for your gut health, because when our gut has a break from digesting food, it has a chance to regenerate and repair and heal. When you're eating all the time, it's being damaged all the time. Again, you're not decreasing calories when you're doing the time-restricted eating window. You're just pushing all of your calories into a time period. And then, so you shouldn't be losing weight, right? When you're just doing normal time-restricted eating. It can take a little while for your body to adapt to burning fats. It wants to burn glucose. It is easier for your body to burn glucose, so it's going to want to do that. And burning fat takes a little bit of energy, so it's a little bit resistant, and it likes to keep the pantry full. So you're going to have to just practice and when you start to get that hunger feeling, wait 10 minutes. It usually goes away. Distract yourself, go for a walk. Doing something light and easy and distracting can get you over little hurdles, and then your body will figure out that it can go and break down fat for energy. The toxins I just talked about, you don't want to release too many toxins when you're fasting. Start with your time restricted eating. So do the 10-hour window first, do that for a week, see how it feels. Try to get it to an 8-hour window. When the 8-hour window is easy, then you're ready to sort of progress to a 24-hour window. If you get that heart racing feeling, some people when they start to fast will get like an anxiety feeling. It feels like their heart rate has increased. This is because low nutrients is a type of stressor, and it can stimulate adrenaline, and adrenaline will make you feel anxiety. It's a stress hormone. And so as you get used to fasting, that will go away. Herbal teas are really great because it helps to get rid of the oxidized molecules. If you're going to try a 3-day fast, pick a time when you're not going to be super busy, but also it's nice to be able to have things to distract yourself. Maybe the first few times you do a longer fast, you want to have some naps, you want to meditate, you want to, read a book, you want to be able to relax and not be super stressed. If you have tons of other stress, it's going to be really difficult. Another thing that actually is a really good distraction while you're fasting is to clean something in your house. So I always think of time restricted eating is like doing the surface cleaning. You do your dishes and sweep the floor, and you kind of do some maintenance. But when you do a 3-day fast, this is like cleaning out the attic or cleaning out the back of the cupboards or, cleaning out your desk drawers. And so sometimes when you're fasting, if you actually physically clean out a closet or some drawers, it also mentally just makes you feel really good because you're cleaning your house like you're cleaning your body. Anyway, I find that to be beneficial when I'm doing a long fast. You can still go for walks, but listen to your body. If you feel really weak and faint, then don't do it. You can use blood sugar monitors and ketone monitors. So when your blood sugar, as you go through the fast and you get to, hour 36 to 48, that's usually about when your blood sugar is going to come down and stabilize, and your ketones are going to come up. Once your ketones are higher than your blood glucose levels, then generally you can be pretty sure that you're in autophagy mode where you're deep cleaning the back of the closets kind of thing. So if you do get blood glucose and ketone monitors, make sure the units are the same. In Canada, we measure with millimoles. I forget what the American measurements are, but so just keep that in mind if you do like to monitor your blood. If you are getting close to the end of a 72-hour fast and you're like, oh man, I'm dying so much, but I really want to make it. You can push it a little bit by consuming some fat. Not carbs and not protein, because you'll make insulin and mTOR and then it's over. But if you want to put a little bit of butter into a cup of weak coffee, or have just a little bite of an avocado or a scoop of sour cream or plain yogurt or a little sip of bone broth, right? Then you can push it a little bit because the fat won't completely take you out of ketosis. If you did that for a period of time, like if you were to continue sipping bone broth, you will find that gradually your blood sugar will start to go up and your ketones will start to go down. And then you won't be fasting anymore. But it is a little bit of a trick if you want to push it just a bit longer. Another trick is that stimulants decrease your appetite. So I find, because I normally eat somewhere around 11 or noon, and then I normally eat somewhere around 6 or 7 p.m., those times are harder when I'm doing a 3-day fast. So if I have a little bit of weak coffee, it gets me over that hump because stimulants decrease your appetite. So that can help. Don't have strong coffee though, because then you might have that adrenaline effect. And then when you're not fasting, make sure that you're consuming all the good, healthy nutrients that you need. You need all of your macromolecules. You want to eat healthy plants and animals. You need your micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. Because if you're deficient in anything, you're going to have hunger. Your brain will stimulate hunger if you're deficient. So make sure you're not deficient in anything. And then reduce other stress factors, because then your body is going to make you want to eat. Sometimes if your nervous system feels like, it's getting a little bit too much adrenaline, you can have some magnesium, and that will help calm the nervous system. But take a kind of magnesium that doesn't have any sugar or flavoring, because that can stimulate insulin. And then your body weight. Often during a 3-day fast, you can lose anywhere from 3 to 5 or 6 pounds. That is not permanent. When you eat again, so a lot of that will be water weight as well. And then when you eat again, your brain will probably make you hungrier the days after fasting to bring you back up. And so you will most likely gain that weight back. This kind of fasting is not about losing weight. It's about cleaning out your cells. Okay, so think of it that way. There's other ways to lose weight. This can help. Time-restricted eating can help regulate body weight, but don't think about a 3-day fast as, oh, I'm going to lose all kinds of weight and keep it off. You're not going to. You're going to be hungrier when you go back, and you'll go back to a set point. And my last thing, and I know I went over an hour, sorry about that, but the last thing that makes it easier is if for about 2 days before you do a long fast, if you take away carbohydrates from your diet and you eat as much protein and fat and vegetables as you want until you're full, so you're not fasting, but you're not eating carbs, it gets your body into the mode of breaking down fat to make energy. And then when you switch into a long fast, it's way easier. And there you go. That is all the information about fasting.